All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to Resilience Week. My name is Rebecca Vinnert, and I am the chair of the Greater Williamsburg Trauma Informed Community Network. And we have been having a wonderful week with wonderful presentations, and we are so glad that you have joined us today for this presentation on surviving and thriving trauma and resilience. We are joined today by Stephen House and Lisa Ellsworth, who are going to be co-presenting. Stephen House is the president of Spectrum Health Solutions. He has been in the mental health field for over 15 years, starting at a residential treatment facility just an hour north of Pittsburgh, while also volunteering his time at the Barber National Institute, working with individuals with intellectual disabilities. He attended the University of Pittsburgh and Edinburgh University, obtaining degrees in history and psychology, and is also a veteran of the United States Armed Forces. So thank you for your service, Stephen.
Welcome.
Lisa Ellsworth is the program manager for the Western Tidewater ForKids. She has a BS in psychology and holds certifications in victims advocacy and trauma-informed care. Prior to working with ForKids, Lisa lived in Ohio and was the co-founder of Alley Kids, a nonprofit working with at-risk families and youth, as well as victims of domestic violence. Lisa loves working with the community and direct service providers to bring awareness and education to homelessness and trauma-informed care. And I did not mention this at the beginning, but this is a collaborative between the Greater Williamsburg Trauma-Informed Community Network and the Hampton Roads Trauma-Informed Care Network. So we're happy to be working on this together. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephen and Lisa.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for your time today. We're going to be presenting some really awesome information. So we're going to jump right into it. And some of you might have been familiar with some of the information that I've seen if you've attended any of my presentations before. But this one is actually more concentrated on resilience. So you might see some things that are familiar. You might see some things that are new. So with that, we will get forward. So the first slide we have is, because I ain't got a pencil. So I'm just going to read this out loud to everybody and let everybody think about what this says to them. So I woke myself up because we ain't got no alarm clock. Dug in the dirty clothes basket because ain't nobody washed my uniform. Brushed my hair and teeth in the dark because the lights ain't on. Even got my baby sister ready because my mama wasn't home. Got us both to school on time to eat us a good breakfast. Then when I got to class, the teacher fussed because I ain't got a pencil. So when you read that and you think about that, being trauma informed and looking at the world through a trauma informed lens, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is usually, you know, that teacher wasn't really looking through a trauma-informed lens because he got fussed at. So learning and educating ourselves what it means to be trauma-informed and teaching resilience as well will help everyone become a little bit more embraced and educated in trauma and react to things a little bit more differently, especially in the world stage that we have today. Looking at things and situations and people through a trauma-informed lens to greatly improve everybody's situation. But moving right along, I have a short video that me and Lisa would think that, you know, want everybody to view, and it's got a lot of informative information. So let's begin there.
Last year in America, 3.5 million people didn't have a place to sleep and were considered homeless. That includes 1.5 million children who didn't have a place to call home. These are kids like 6-year-old Maria, who has 2 little sisters, a backpack, and a pencil, but no bed. Homelessness is defined as sleeping in places not meant for human habitation. Most people without homes either sleep outside, in their cars, or in homeless shelters. I think we can all agree that sleeping outside or in your car are not places meant for human habitation. But I'm going to argue that most of our traditional homeless shelters are also not places meant for human habitation. Brain research shows us that the kinds of shelters most of our communities have actually make it harder for the people who stay there to get out of homelessness. I'm here to share there's a better way to shelter, using trauma-informed design and architecture. For the last 12 years, I've been the executive director of a nonprofit that operates shelters for homeless families with children. I've worked with thousands of people without homes, and I have seen how hard homelessness can be on a person and a family. I've also seen how our traditional homeless shelters make things worse for the people who stay there. To understand why this is, let's take a look at some brain science, which helps us understand what goes on in the brain when someone experiences something as stressful as homelessness. You see, when anyone's brain is exposed to any stress, the brain releases chemicals to help us get through that stress. If it's positive, motivating stress like buying a new home or finals week at school, the brain releases chemicals that promote emotional regulation, critical thinking, and logical thought, all very good things that get you through stress. But when it's negative stress, the brain releases different chemicals that put you into what I call survival mode, because it focuses on making sure you just survive whatever stress you're confronted with. When you're in survival mode, the chemical reaction turns off your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's responsible for all of our uniquely human brain functions. Things like critical thinking and comprehension, logic and rationality. You don't have these things available to you in survival mode because your prefrontal cortex is unplugged and offline. Even if you tried really hard, this chemical reaction would prevent you from bringing it back online. You're left in survival mode, the fight, flight, or freeze system that leaves you on high alert, ready for danger. Survival mode is really helpful, say when you're in the wild and you see a lion. Survival mode helps you get ready to fight that lion or run away from that lion to protect yourself and save your life. But survival mode is also triggered in response to stress like domestic violence and homelessness. Losing your home causes you to have the same brain reaction that confronting a lion in the wild does. And when you experience homelessness for several weeks, months, or even years, your brain stays in survival mode that whole time. Survival mode stops being momentarily life-saving, like when that lion's running at you, and it starts being maladaptive. It turns into a trauma, where the brain is so overwhelmed with stress chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline that it starts to rewire itself into being in a constant stress response. Even when there's nothing to be afraid of, the brain is hypervigilant about scanning the environment to find where that danger might come from next. As a result of this hypervigilant survival mode, you experience slowed thinking. You have a hard time making decisions and you just can't concentrate. You can only understand every third word said to you. You have a hard time sleeping and you can't regulate your emotions. Sometimes you have outbursts at the tiniest things, and other times, just to get away from the stress and anxiety in your head, you emotionally detach and become indifferent. And it's not because you're a bad parent or a stupid person. It's because your brain is releasing chemicals that keep you in this hypervigilant state, always looking for that dangerous lion. Survival mode leads to negative health outcomes. When you experience prolonged survival mode, you're more likely to get lung cancer, hepatitis, and lung disease like COPD. You're 4 times as likely to be depressed, and you're 12 times as likely to commit suicide. Eventually, prolonged exposure to survival mode leads to early death. The average life expectancy of someone who is homeless is only 49 years old. One would hope that going into a homeless shelter would help stop this survival mode and help us get back on to our thinking parts of our brains. But that isn't what happens. Our traditional homeless shelters actually make this stress response worse because they're set up in messy and chaotic ways that just exacerbate the stress and anxiety in the brain. Shelters are often in warehouses with long rows of cots on the floor, leaving people without any dignity or privacy. Shelters have rigid expectations that make people feel powerless and controlled. There are long lists of rules that people are supposed to read, understand, and follow, even though survival mode prevents them from having things like reading comprehension and impulse control available to them. People can't get a job or be able to get back into housing because their thinking part of their brain is literally turned off. These folks that we sometimes just assume are lazy and not even trying to help themselves are actually being prevented from helping themselves because they're in survival mode, and our messy, chaotic shelters are making things worse. I'm here to share there's a better way to shelter. There's a way to provide shelter that actually helps people get out of survival mode and back into the thinking parts of their brain. And what if I told you the key to getting people out of survival mode was in the walls and the ceiling? That's right, the built environment, the architecture and design of a place can literally change the chemical reaction in the brain, helping you to think logically and understand the world again. That way, you can actually understand and follow the shelter rules. You can benefit from the services that shelter wants to provide, and you can make the kinds of change you want to see in your life. A better way to shelter. Trauma-informed shelters are beautiful places that make you feel good when you walk in. They build dignity and restore power. They have room for flexible spaces where tots, teens, pets, and adults can all be themselves. The trauma-informed design features the color palette of the ocean, blues, greens, and turquoises with little color contrast. We feature round forms and curved spaces that bring a sense of uplift and positivity. There's privacy and solitude if desired, but there's also space to be in community and build relationships. There's a strong sense of abundance and a connection to nature through natural plants, woods, and natural materials. These design elements create an environment where, just by being in the physical shelter building, people start to have more access to the logical thinking part of their brain. So what if we stopped designing shelters as rows of cots on the floor, which we know put people in survival mode and lead to negative health outcomes and can eventually result in death, and started designing shelters using trauma-informed design and architecture? Initial research shows that trauma-informed design produces better outcomes for shelters. Things like shorter shelter stays and greater success moving into housing. We could create a movement in this country where we change the way one of our most basic social services is provided to a way that actually helps people heal from the crisis and trauma of homelessness and make changes for the better in their lives. But it doesn't just have to stop at shelters. The principles of trauma-informed design and architecture can be applied anywhere, especially places we experience stress. Doctors' offices, schools and universities, our homes. We could start to create spaces that promoted positive brain functioning and started to help all of us better deal with our stress. A better way to shelter, a better way to live. Thank you.
So the video actually covered a lot of area that we're going to touch base on today as well, leading into resilience. Understanding trauma, sheltering is a better way to shelter, and looking at the other shelters that were there, will understand, if they're in, a mode of their brain which is constantly producing adrenaline, and they're in survival mode all the time, that means they're still not able to reconnect with the rational part and logical part of the brain. But we're going to go into understanding trauma. So what is trauma? Trauma is a response to a perceived threat to survival or emotional well-being of an individual or large group, such as a community or a culture. Trauma leads to adverse brain, bodily, and psychological changes that damage self, relational and spiritual development, and impair living and learning and working as well. So trauma has a lot of effects to it, such as trying to be independent. So when we're working with individuals, or you might see somebody struggling to improve themselves, but they're dealing with a trauma, they're going to find, more and more and more, they're going to find ways to self-prophesize themselves to not be able to become successful, because their part of the brain that is under a lot of adrenaline is not allowing them to think logically. So going on to what is trauma. So individual reacts as though their event experience is happening here and now. So when somebody is reacting to something, it's really, the here and now, but they're thinking it's there and then. It has specific parts where it does have physical effects on the brain. And I think this is what I'm really going to go into, where everybody thinks that trauma is a mental and emotional thing, but it does have physical aspects to it as well. So we're looking at two brains right here. Some of you might be familiar with this slide. So looking at the brains here, there are two brains from 3-year-old children. The image on the left is a healthy child, while the image on the right is from a Romanian orphan who suffered severe sensory deprivation. The right brain is smaller and has large ventral holes in the center of the brain. It also shows a shrunken cortex, the brain's outer layer. So as she was saying in the video, when you are in the fight, flight, or freeze, and you're not thinking with the logical brain, and you are basically working off adrenaline constantly, it definitely does not promote brain growth. It actually prohibits the actual physical growth of the brain. So when you have a physical growth of the brain and you are in that fight, flight, or freeze mode constantly, you're going to have a lack of impulse control. You're going to be very impulsive and stuff like that. You're going to have hypersensitive reactions to situations that people normally wouldn't have a hyper-reactive response to, such as slamming of a trunk of a car. Just that noise itself, somebody might have an exaggerated response. But looking at the display here, you can definitely see that this brain, which has not gone through a lot of trauma, and has not experienced, extreme trauma, is very healthy. But if you look at the brain on the right side, you can see a lot more darker areas around it. And that is the actual cranial fluid that is there, because more cranial fluid is there because it hasn't allowed for this brain to fully develop and expand in the way that it should and develop in the way that it should. So therefore, when you have a smaller brain, it also prohibits the ability to function as a brain that is actually at a place where it's supposed to be in developmental stage.
Stephen, can I jump in?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
So you can think of the Romanian orphan brain, which is an extreme contrast to a healthy brain, is kind of being dehydrated and inhibiting, speech and executive functioning and all of those things. But if we look at trauma, what is trauma? And I think that was a great definition of trauma. But what kinds of trauma are there? I mean, we saw the video on homelessness, but you could substitute domestic violence. You could substitute cultural inequality. You could substitute intersectionality. Any of those things would have the same definition, or the same things would apply, the same responses would apply to the trauma response. So I just wanted to put that in there.
No, that's a perfect example, because when we do in-person presentations, which I love, the virtual thing is still something I'm adapting to.
We are.
But basically, just piggybacking off what Lisa's saying is, let's just say there's a child that has a parent who has a substance abuse issue or an alcohol issue, and they're in their room doing work, and they're constantly not wondering, and they're being abused by this parent, and they're constantly not. They're wondering what parent is going to walk through that door that afternoon. Is it going to be the parent that's going to beat, or is it going to be the one that's going to be nice? Just not that knowing generates anxiety. Just not knowing generates that, active response and that adrenaline going. So that's why when we go into these situations and we learn more about trauma, the effects of trauma, and how to be resilient, we have to understand that what is predictable is preventable, and what is predictable is also safe. So if a child is very structured routine and has healthy, the parents have healthy parent coaching and stuff like that, and they're able to predict events, then they feel a lot more safe. But for a child who lives in a world that's unpredictable due to, elements in their world, such as a parent who has a substance abuse issue, wondering whether, they're going to get beat that night or not, they're constantly looking over their shoulder. So being in that constant state definitely prohibits the growth of the brain. So there are definitely different types of trauma. And now that's the trauma that I see in my realm, is trauma that children and adolescents go through that sometimes are triggered by events that have happened through family systems. So, and those are a part of the impacts of trauma. So we're going to cover that real quick. Impacts of trauma on the brain. So we have the lower brain, which is the emotional brain, and then we have the thinking brain, which is the logical brain. So for some of you who have seen the video, there is what we call an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. So if we're looking at the downstairs brain with the intrinsic brain and the emotional brain, that is the area upon which that our fight, flight, or freeze responses take place. And then on the thinking brain, which is the top part of the brain, that's where we do all of our logical thinking, like the actual rational, making good decisions, having the time to think about it, and so forth. And you're not in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. But however, when the traumatic event has been triggered, what happens then is the top brain is flipped. So if you ever heard anybody who's like, okay, flipped his lid. So that's where that would come in. And basically, if somebody's lid has been flipped, such as an adolescent or a child, or somebody that that we're working with, or somebody that you see is having a challenge right there and going through a traumatic experience or reliving a traumatic experience, they'll be in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and it's really hard for them to really rationalize and make decisions and make positive choices, and they become very impulsive and they lose those abilities. So when sheltering in a better way, which was a great video, is basically helping these individuals come back online with their top brain, being able to reconnect with their lower part of the brain and be able to do the logical thinking and have logical responses and be able to plan and move forward and learn and become more resilient to things and overcome challenges and be able to handle their trauma in a more positive manner and be able to work themselves through it. But going back to still working with the brain, we have two sides of our brain. So there is the right and the left hemisphere. So as you can see by this diagram, which I love this diagram, so a little cartoon picture here, we can see that the left side of the brain is our analytical side. That's the side that handles like math, linguistics, language, stuff like that. And on the right side, we have this nice, wonderful artistic place where, our ideas and thoughts are generated and so forth. And as you look at this picture, you see little bridges that connect between the right and the left side of the brain. They talk, they communicate with one another. And we're going to go into a little exercise real quick that we're all going to do, in our, in front of our computers. And so that way I can give you an actual demonstration of how the right and left brain talk. But I also want to make a little note here that the right side of the brain actually controls the left side of the body, and the left brain controls the right side of the body. And I always get that. Does that mean that people who are, left-handed are they the only people that are in their right mind? So that's just a little bad joke there.
I like this slide because, you think about the creative side of your brain, you think about the executive functioning, the analytical side. And for me, when I see those bridges, I am always reminded that, we have this wonderful ability to create and design. And when those two sides are connected, the one that dreams is affected by the one that can make it happen. So we can dream all we want, but if we don't have the other side functioning and working together, we're not going to be able to create our dreams. And so when I think about that, I really like the dream part. I'm more of a left brain kind of girl, but you need that. And we lose that in trauma, and not just with children, we lose that in adults too. So people who have been exposed to prolonged traumatic events or live in poverty, or people who maybe have just had, one major traumatic event as an adult, you start to lose those bridges become fragile and they become brittle and they can break. But there is good news on the horizon.
Yeah, so as these bridges are there and they communicate between the right and left brain, just as Lisa said, those bridges can be deteriorated. Some bridges can be, teared down altogether. But the good news is the brain is a very well-oiled machine, and it has the ability to utilize what we call neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is our ability for the left and right brain and our brain functions to find other pathways around. So maybe the shortcut isn't there anymore to the way of thinking that somebody would need to logically think and have those right and left brains connect. But it'll find another pathway that can be just as efficient. So, and how you strengthen those is by trying to do more exercises, brain activities, all sorts of things that'll actually assist in growing and strengthening that neuroplasticity to create and generate its own bridge and a new way of thinking. But going into the left and right brain, so we're going to do a little exercise. Some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not. So I'm hoping you find this a little interesting to help us understand how our right and left brain talk. So right here, we have a little grid here with some random letters and some random colors, which are amazing. So what we're going to do is, if everybody, when they can see this, I'm going to point to one of these, each box here, and I want everyone to say to themselves, if out loud, if possible. I really would like to do them, have them say it out loud. You don't have to turn your microphone on or anything. So I'm going to point to it, and we're going to just call out the colors, right? Don't worry about the letters. The letters are insignificant, but we're going to, talk about the colors. So first box is going to be red, green, yellow, green,
black,
red, and that looks like brown. My screen. Yellow, black, red, green, black, yellow, black, brown. I think that's a brown. I want to say it's a brown.
It's like taupe.
Yeah, it's like taupe. And then we have black again, and we have red, and the last one is green. This time.
The trick is to do it faster.
Yeah, we're going to go fast this time. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to call out, we're going to actually read the words. We're not going to identify, the colors here as far as the color that we see. We want to read the words. So let's start here. So we have blue, yellow, black, red, blue, orange,
green.
I almost want to say brown, yellow, red, or no, black, and then it's red.
Wow, you are so messed.
Green, black, and then we have green, blue, blue, brown, black, red, or no, purple, and then green. So as you can see, even I struggle with that sometimes. So some people do have the ability to do that very well, and some people struggle a little bit with it. But when you feel that little awkwardness going on, that's your right and left brain communicating. So let that exercise be a little bit of evidence to you of how important it is for your right and left brain to have those bridges there and have, be able to communicate like that. Now, if we were having challenges there, you can only understand how stressful it can be for somebody who doesn't have those connections that are just as strong. So, and how you lose those connections is through traumatic events and stress. So we're going to talk about 3 types of stress really quick. So we have positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. So the types of positive stress that you're going to go through is positive stress is like, going through and working towards doing that term paper if you're a college student, or going to the gym and really, working your body out, and the positive stress that you're getting from that. And it has a positive outcome to that. So if you do your studying, you're stressed out from all that, but you get a good grade, the positive stress. Working out at the gym, you're really putting your body under physical stress. And the outcome of that is a result of that. So those are types of positive stress. Then we have tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is the stresses that, we all endure, in our everyday lives. Stress does appear, but it's our ability to be able to come back from that stress, to be able to, find some type of peace afterwards, or be able to process that stress, find a direction, and find a solution to overcome that stress.
I would also say that tolerable stress, what makes stress tolerable, and we can think about friends or maybe our own parents, or who maybe have gone through a divorce. And I'm sure if you think about it, you've known someone who went through a divorce and really didn't have much of a support system. So for them, that divorce can become toxic stress. Mm-hmm. But for the person who has a great support system, the stress is tolerable. We're not going through it by myself. I still have connection to other people, and therefore I can bear what I'm going through because I can see that there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly. Then we have toxic stress. Toxic stresses are the stresses that we really find hard to come back from. And it's really hard, especially when you don't have support there. An example that I was given is, think of a young individual who had just lost their last remaining family member, and a hand on the shoulder at those points, even just the connection, the physical connection involved is there for support, can mean mountains versus that hand never being there to be able to place that hand on that shoulder, to not be able to have that support to bounce back from. Or toxic stress is not having to be able to back off and come back from that tolerable stress.
Or the
And so,
stress is just so incredibly prolonged that eventually it just wears you down and you find yourself in a, fight, flight, or freeze forever. It's interesting. We are built to be a community. Humans are not supposed to be alone, and we're looking for connection. And if you think about what happens during trauma, it rips our connections away from us. It isolates us from our communities and our friends, our family, our loved ones, our sense of self, our identity. So it's really important to make sure that you as an individual, and then the people in your community, your family, those around you. I use community. Community is a big circle. It can be my child, it could be my neighbor 2 miles away, the people I work with. So my community, my circle of people, it's important to make sure that we recognize those folks that are going through these sorts of stressors, and we be good neighbors and good family and good community and support them through that. Even when they act like they don't want it, we can find a way. We just have to make sure we're not hurting instead of helping, which is some of the things, if you think back to the shelter example, people are trying to help, but they're really hurting. So we have to be intentional and strategic about the way we approach people going through trauma and the way we approach ourselves.
so the next thing we're going to go into is complex trauma and toxic trauma or toxic stress. Sorry about that. And Lisa, I'm going to let you take it from there on this one.
Well, I think we just talked about it a little bit. Complex trauma, of course, you guys can read these slides. I'm not going to get into it. I'm not going to read them for you. I hate it when people read to me. But, if you look at the different kinds of toxic stress, trauma, complex trauma, you can see a variety of different things. And even each one individually is going to cause a traumatic response. It's going to stick with someone. They're always going to have that, carry that with them. Now, whether or not they carry it with them and it's always going to be something that inhibits their ability to move forward, or if it's something that they have built resilience, they have a built-in resilience, or they've learned to build resilience and they can overcome it. One of the things that I've learned with working with people who have experienced, lifelong trauma, or my husband's also a retired combat veteran, so he's had some event, trauma, is that people get tired of talking about their trauma too, and they don't want to be recognized for like, oh, that's the girl that, was homeless, or, oh, that's the guy that did this. So we can traumatize people by assigning them this victim, station that they stay in forever. Also, when you look at this, these are all individually, you can see that people can have more than one. And a lot of folks, especially the people that live in poverty, live in, communities where there's a lot of historical trauma, they carry this stuff around with them constantly. And is there any real, surprise that within the communities that are experiencing high rates of trauma, I mean, you get up to go to school, but you're tired because the cops are at your neighbors all night long and the sirens were going off and there's no electricity and you don't have anything to grab for breakfast and your clothes aren't clean. Your parents, aren't home because maybe they're working or maybe they're passed out. You never know. But so you can see how these things can compound. So trauma is something that affects everyone. It can be a global event. It can be an earthquake. But when you start looking at complex trauma, usually there's one or more of those. At least one, and usually more, that really can compound what trauma does to that person and how their ability to adapt and build resilience can be minimized. But we can mitigate those factors. So trauma, again, these are the things that you can impact your worldview. It can impact your yourself, your identity, the way you view relationships. Your ability to connect with others, which we know is one of the most important things we need to do as humans. You can go to the next one, Stephen. So hard doing this on Zoom. We're used to being like side by side, where we have these physical cues and we know each other.
Yeah.
Go ahead, take it off. This is your slide.
Yeah. So basically, I'm going to just touch base. By now, I'm hoping that the ACEs have actually gotten out to where a lot of people are familiar with them. If you are not, I'm about to give you a really quick overview. So ACEs. ACE is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what is an ACE? So if you look on this side, it'll give you the list of recurring physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, incarcerated household member, violence between adults, parental separation, or divorce. So the ACE questions, it's a questionnaire and it has a list of 10 questions. And so for each one that somebody responds yes to, that equals to a score of 1. And as your score increases, your risk increases. So anybody who has an ACE score of 6 or above, it is statistically, the data shows that statistically you are at risk of, your life expectancy being shortened by 20 years. So, and people, I've had people ask before, how do I get that 20 years back? Well, luckily the ACE is just a tool to let us know and to let you know what you are at risk for. And once you understand what you are at risk for, then, we can put some, factors in play that'll help you become resilient. And as you become more resilient and you become more understanding, more cognizant, more mindful of yourself and your awareness and so forth, that risk, is really not a set risk for you, but it's just really a tool. But how this works is we see this pyramid here. So we have adverse childhood experiences. So anybody that goes through a childhood experience, a traumatic experience as a child, for this part, and this can also be applied for people having trauma later in life as well. That is so extreme that it causes disrupted neurodevelopment, can cause dramatic changes to the brain. Even as an adult, even though your brain is developed, it can put it in a state of hypervigilance and super exaggerated responses. But from the ACEs perspective, as you grow and your brain develops, it will really disrupt the development of your brain. So if you remember the slide that we showed with the Romanian brain versus the other brain, you'll see that had neuro development that was disrupted. When you have a brain that is not fully developed and it has disrupted neurodevelopment, you'll then see deficiencies in social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. So that means when you have a cognitive impairment, you become impulsive. You don't really make all the positive choices. Your ability to think logically is really been impacted. So you're not thinking as logically as you would if you hadn't experienced that trauma. So when that happens, there's the adoption going to the next level. There's the adoption of health risk behaviors, such as smoking. There'll be people who will go to alcohol. They'll, abuse substances, not because they want to feel high, because they want to feel less.
Sometimes it's just risk-taking behaviors. It can be, doing something that puts your physical being at risk, or, promiscuity, where you can put your health and your social or your emotional well-being at risk. We see that a lot with women and young people who have had sexual traumas, that they act that out again and again in ways that are not healthy for them. And it seems like the opposite thing would occur. That's how they would respond to that, but that's not true. We know that's not true. Risk-taking behaviors are probably one of the things that we see the most, that are the hardest for people who are doing these things to really, understand and to trace back to why they do these things.
So when you adopt those health risk behaviors, those lead into disease, disability, and social problems. Just like Lisa was saying, promiscuity, that increases your risk of contracting, an STD, which could be very severe and lethal. Alcoholism, could lead into, liver failure, which leads into, your organs shutting down. And then finally, all the, depending on what it is, those lead to early death. So understanding those risk factors, you can tell why they say that you lose 20 years of your life. But making the necessary changes and using ACEs as a tool to find out what you are at risk for will help you be able to decrease and move your life onto a new path and generate some resilience to where you can make better choices and improve your quality of life. But like we were talking about, ACEs in health and social problems. So here are some of the social problems. I'm just going to go over a few of these because these lead into, the physical issues that are happening. These are the risk factors that are involved, such as cancer, diabetes, as I mentioned, STD, definitely depression, suicide, as I mentioned, smoking or the initiation of smoking, adolescent pregnancy, and risk for intimate partner violence, just so many health and social problems. But let's also look at the school factor for young children when it comes to adverse childhood experiences and school performance. So students dealing with trauma are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade, score lower on standardized tests and assessments, have more receptive and expressive language difficulties, are suspended and expelled, found eligible for special education, and more frequently. So basically, going back to some of the things that we've already discussed, I think it's pretty obvious if you have a child that is dealing with traumatic events or dysfunctional family at home, it's going to be really hard for them to use the rational part of the brain, to be able to sit, to be able to focus, to be able to retain information, to be motivated to work towards that information when they have other things that their adrenaline is pumping and preparing them for, because they don't know if they have to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And imagine trying to do your homework when you're in that modality. It's really not positive. So
you think about the last 2 slides with the adults and then the children. So trauma creates this environment where we're having all these risk factors for adults and children, which is just creating more trauma. We're compounding trauma on top of trauma. So I have a terrible life at home, and now I just failed 5th grade. I'm behind with my peers. Now I'm getting bullied. I mean, you can see it. Or, I had a really traumatic event or upbringing or relationship, and, I started smoking, and now I have lung cancer, but that's not traumatizing at all, is it? So it's just like this vicious cycle that just compounds the deeper you get. And the only thing that can combat any of this is resilience. And that's the magic key to all of this.
Some common post-traumatic triggers will be, post-traumatic triggers will be recalling of traumatic events. There's studies have been shown that actually discussing the event multiple times over, it can be more traumatic than actually being in the moment of the traumatic event itself. Not being allowed to speak, being ignored, all these things are common post-traumatic triggers. Being told no, criticism and feedback. Some people just aren't able to take criticism and feedback so well. Just going back to that individual who, child who just failed the 5th grade, you're going to take criticism. Well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you do this? And then you go into, well, this happened, and this happened. So they're not able to take that. So these are some common post-traumatic triggers. Oops, sorry. So going into the survival response, just to clarify the fight, flight, or freeze. So the fight is the individual struggles to regain or hold on to power, especially when feeling coerced. It can be mislabeled as non-compliant or combative. Flight, individual disengages, no shows or checkouts emotionally, and this is mislabeled as uncooperative or resistant. Freeze, individual gives into those positions of power, does not or is unable to speak up, and this is mislabeled as passive or unmotivated. I just wanted to go over those because sometimes our interpretation guides our intervention. So when we looking through a trauma-informed lens, when just being in public, talking with people, you don't really have to be an individual who is in the mental health field, but if everybody gets the education that they need to try to view the world through more of a trauma-informed lens, and having this education would be more helpful for them when trying to communicate with somebody who is in the fight, flight, or freeze phase. And there are people who are seeking to cope. So Lisa, I'll let you take this one from here.
So seeking to cope. So when we're traumatized, and we've all had traumatic events in our lives, or maybe long histories with trauma, we're looking to reconnect, right? We're looking to, if we can find some way to get our brains back online, and we're trying to cope with whatever the feelings of sense of loss of identity or community. We're looking to connect, and sometimes behaviors can be really helpful, and sometimes they can be really hurtful. And sometimes, like our video told us earlier, that behaviors that are really helpful initially can harm us later on. So what is it that we have to do to help ourselves and our communities find healthy coping mechanisms? I want you to think about that, kind of keep it in the back of your mind while we're going through this. Is think about the ways that, some of us cope and that are healthy, and some of the ways that we cope. And they don't have to be extreme examples like alcoholism and drug use, or, it could be overeating or, withdrawal or self, sabotaging relationships because of a fear that you're going to have to go through trauma again. So kind of think about those things. And what we need to do is, even though people, may have irrational fear because of trauma, we have to validate and affirm their feelings. It doesn't mean that they're coming up with good responses, but it does mean that's the way they feel. So when we help people, we have to legitimize their feelings, even when it doesn't make sense, and help them find healthier coping mechanisms and build resiliency so that they can defend against the trauma that they've had. And the trauma we all know that we're going to incur. I mean, we're going to lose a parent, we're going to face a divorce. Something's going to happen throughout our lifetime where we're going to be traumatized, and we can prepare for that. So family experiences, we know a lot of trauma starts at home. We know that, families of color and non-English speakers and people living in poverty, they are subjected to some of the worst traumas, plural, that our society faces. And so we need to understand that, we need to recognize that, and we need to work to mitigate those circumstances within those communities. And there's lots of things that we can do, and teaching them and helping them and flooding them with resources and building resilience is something that is important for all the chickens I know of, and that's really what we're out here to do. Again, these are kind of basic. We all understand, really, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. We understand that there's lots of symptoms of traumatic events, and we know that connecting, that sense of community and reconnecting with another person really is what can be the platform for healing. Of course, if you're connecting with people who are also traumatized or maybe aren't in a healthy place themselves, then that can be counterproductive. So I know that we strive to be as healing focused as we can, so that we can benefit the people that we serve.
So going back to, piggybacking up, the healing happens in a relationship. Still need to ask ourselves some questions, do some reframing and stuff like that. So when healing happens in a relationship, I don't know, I'm sure that maybe some of us have heard or said or seen, that person's just attention seeking. So at that point, I don't say attention seeking anymore. I try to reframe that to the best of my ability. So instead of saying attention seeking, I believe that they're connection seeking. They're seeking a connection. And what purpose is that connection? Is it a healing connection? There is a need there. So if we can find out what somebody's need is, then, we could rather respond to the need rather than react to a behavior. So sometimes it's just about finding somebody's need and doing some reframing as well. So here's some examples and questions to ask, when you're observing different behaviors. So instead of intentional misbehavior, is this a lack of skill? Shaming for lack of skills. Well, let's think, how do we build the missing skills? Maybe the education that they lack and they don't have that, and it's something that we can provide. Even from the relationship that we stand as a friend or as a mentor or anything else like that. If we have that ability, how can we help them build those missing skills? Instead of criticizing will help, thinking nurturing will help. Instead of blaming the individual, teaching the individual. Punishment will help, discipline and structure will help. So
that's resilience building.
Yes, it definitely is. And so Lisa, you can go into your part, which is the 7 C's of resilience. I can name
So
the
I'm sure we're trauma-informed, community care network, and we're pretty confident that most of you are familiar with the 7 C's of resilience. If we're going to build resilience, we have to encourage competence. We have to encourage confidence and connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. And all of these are done through relationships. They're all done with the mindset that this is someone that we're working with, or even in our natural lives when we're not. We don't know, I don't know what's going on with all my coworkers, but I still want to focus on these values. To me, they're values that I can demonstrate in my life and model at all time. I want to be encouraging, especially when I don't understand. I don't understand someone, I want to encourage them to explain that to me. I want to build their confidence. I want to create a connection so that even if we do disagree about something, even if it's something, as that's, really important to both of us, that we can still be connected as people, that we can still find a way to connect. So building resilience through the 7 C's are important. I know you guys know this because I feel like you just have been doing this. So resilience, what does this mean? Resilience is, it is a cycle just like trauma is, and it's something that we can build and that builds healthy adaptive behaviors. What does bouncing back mean? What does that really look like? How do we do that? If you've got, an event, a trauma in your life that, is holding you back, or you work with folks that that have a trauma or traumas that hold them back, what does bouncing back look like? Is that what it looks like from your perspective, or is it what it looks like from their perspective? One of the things that I always like to ask, our homeless families who come in and we have to do these intakes, and, they have to tell all these awful things and report on, what their finances look like and how they get here in the first place. It's absolutely awful. But, state, federal government requires us to have answers to these questions, which not very trauma informed, if you want my opinion, which probably don't. But how does bouncing back, what does that look like for them? How do they get through that? What are their thoughts? What is going right with them? And that's what we want to focus on. If you want to build resilience with people, it's got to be strength-based. It's got to be, you have to help them identify the things within them, the characteristics they have, or abilities or skills or whatever it is that they feel good about themselves. And then you have to foster that and help them apply those same, principles, values, skills, whatever it is, to the things that aren't going well. So individual coping skills, how do we do that? We model it. I mean, we can talk about it, and it's easy to sit in a healing circle and tell people, well, you should do this. But how do you really do that? You model behavior. You offer grace even when you are uncomfortable, even when you feel, maybe emotionally threatened. You sit in the awkward moment and you support that person. Individual resilience, I'm not going to read these to you, but that is, individual resilience isn't built by an individual. It's built by people connected to that individual who are supporting that individual. That's why folks who are in toxic stress, they don't have a support system and they crash and burn. They have an inability to bring their self back online, to be able to not feel like they're constantly monitoring for the next threat. But they don't do that alone. They to get through that, you need people. So we need all of us. And I love that. We need all of us to get through this life and to thrive. And so none of these change, whether you look at individual, interpersonal, or organizational. It still takes a community to do this. And building resilience is supporting each other in healthy ways. And what is it? Community resilience, attachment, regulation, and competence. Once we feel attached and connected, we can let go of the fight, flight, or freeze mode. We can start, taking a chance on trusting and that, we are a valuable part of the community, the world community. And having that, bringing that back or finding that for the first time, especially with children who grow up, in extreme or prolonged abuse, they don't have that. But once they find it, and I've seen it happen, then they can start to self-regulate. And do they know how to self-regulate? No. How do we do that? We teach them. We teach them by modeling it. We teach them by, when they are acting out, by embracing them and listening. I don't mean physically embracing them, but embracing them and listening to them and trying to get through, all of the behaviors to find out where is this coming from, and how can I help you find a way to move past it, or to get through it in a way that it's not going to continuously hold you back. Some traumas we never get over. They're always going to be there. They're always going to pop up. I know no one who's been through horrible, horrible trauma has ever gotten to the point and said, oh, I'm totally over it now. It never even bothers me anymore. Because at some point it's going to come up. It's going to jump up and get you again. But having the ability to rely on your sense of, community, and that you are connected with other people, allows you again to regulate and then builds your competence on being able to move forward and make better choices for yourself. That doesn't mean bad things are not going to continue to happen, but even if they're outside of your control, they're not situations you're putting yourself in, you have the ability to be resilient and to get through it in a tolerable way.
And just to piggyback off that, just from my experience in the military, I actually served with an individual named Sergeant Pete. He was from Kentucky. I'll never forget him. But he was at the end of his commitment that he was already in for over 30 years. He was definitely beyond what people normally retire. And so I served with him for 3 years, and he would tell me things about Vietnam when he was in the Marines and he transitioned over to the Army, but tell me about things in Vietnam, and they were traumatic experiences. So in his way, he felt resilience because I asked him, being young at the time, how did you cope with these things, and it was his ability to be resilient. And he actually used the word resilient. Not in the language that we're used to talking about, but it does formulate, it does fit it fits the mold. But the one thing he had was competency. And competency was like, he talked about it, and that was his way of regulating. And he had the competency to actually, be proactive and not be reactive. He said that he had found a way to actually accept what it was, and it was his choice on how to react. He said it took him some time, and it did take him a little bit of therapy, but he learned that it really did work for him to build his resilience. So, and the next thing we have is doing a resilience slide, or exercise. So here's the two things, and I will read this to you because I want everyone here to think of two people who are very resilient, and the one who is not. So what do the two of them have in common that makes them different from the third in this respect?
It's a rhetorical question. We're not going to ask you guys to tell us about these folks. But right. I think about it. We all know people who, you're like, whoa, you just went through that and you're doing really well. How did you manage that? And then we see folks that, we think we might see it as something, a small event, and they're just, they can't leave their house. So we have to look at the way people, what their level of resilience is and how they got that. I think it's important to talk to people who are, are very resilient and say, like, how did you get here? What was it that made you be able to overcome this? What skills did you use? What people were in your life and what kind of support they provide? I mean, these are important things, and these are conversations, that, I have with my own children, especially ones that don't live in Virginia anymore. When they have something happen, they call home and call mom, like, well, who's with you right now? Or how are you getting through this? And who are you talking to? And, are they giving you, are you getting positive, input from the folks in your circle? And the one thing I know is that if you don't have good people in your life, it's like inviting a thief into your house. There goes your joy, there goes your hope, and there goes your motivation. So having good people in your life, and I don't mean good and bad and an evil, but people who are well-rounded, people who have built resilience, people who understand, are non-judgmental, those are the things that we strive to be, and those are the folks that we want to surround ourselves with. That doesn't mean that the people who don't have those attributes that we just leave by the wayside. We should be actively incorporating folks like that into our circles. So again, here are some great ways to build resilience. Personally, sleep, nutrition, and exercise are my favorite three. I know if I feel like I'm going off the rails, that I look at, am I sleeping? What does my sleep pattern look like? Am I eating like junk food because I didn't pack my lunch all week long? Am I getting enough exercise? Spirituality is something that is important to a lot of people. It doesn't matter what you believe in, but tapping into that part of yourself, individually or as a group, whether it's a church circle or it's a yoga circle, we can tap into that, and that can really build our sense of resilience. Self-talk, how we speak to each other and how do we speak to ourselves. One of the most powerful things someone said to me one time was, I was beating myself up about something I had done wrong. And it was really kind of minor. And I had said, like, I am so stupid. I can't believe I did this. And she walked up to me and she poked her finger in my chest pretty hard, actually. And she said, don't you dare talk to my friend that way. You don't get to talk to my friend that way. So we need to be mindful of how we speak to ourselves, because you know what we say to ourselves, we say to other people. We may not realize it, but that's how it comes out. And instead of building resilience, we're doing something else. We're creating a bigger problem, or a problem where there isn't one. So there's all of these things on here are great things to do. Again, real resilient skills. You know, you've got trauma, something traumatic has happened, or you've had a lot of trauma, and you've got a balance and recovery. You need to cut yourself some slack. You need to cut that other person some slack. I think one of the things that happened, you know, in my world a lot when we're working with homeless families is that someone's been with us for 4 or 5 months, and we've helped them get housing, and we've provided 5 or 6 months of rent, and we've paid for a vocational training, and we're helping with childcare and all these other things, but they're still stuck, right? They're still stuck. And we're like, why aren't you doing better? That's the wrong question again, because we have to look at their environment that they're in. You know, people who are starting out again typically don't have much. So you don't have that, like the lady talked about in the TED talk about, you know, the environmental, you know, the trauma informed, you know, building or room. You can't afford to have these things. So if you're living in poverty in a 2-bedroom apartment that's pretty crappy, how do you build resilience when you don't have all these wonderful, fluffy, you know, teal colored things to decorate? You do that by connecting with others, and you do that by connecting with yourself. And so that's what builds emotional resilience. And then again, once you start building resilience, monitoring your self-talk, monitoring, you know, how you're doing as an individual. Or if you're helping someone else, how are they doing? You know, what is their go-tos when things go wrong, or what are their go-tos when things go right? And how are they thinking about themselves and their worldview? Are they thinking in a positive way, I can get through this? Are they flexible when it comes to solutions? Are they stuck in black and white? It's either A or B. Is it magical thinking? If only I can get here, because we know that never works. We're never going to get to a point where it's going to all be, you know, utopian. So where are we in our thinking? Where are they in their thinking? And how can we help provide them and ourselves with opportunities and options? One thing I see most often with people who are experiencing trauma is they don't see options. They don't see a way out. They don't see that they have other choices to make. So it's up to us to help folks see that they have other choices.
So developing resilience, and just piggybacking off the last slide with thinking and attitudes and stuff like that, we can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we think and respond. So when you're building resilience, if you remember one of those bubbles that were in 2 slides back, was one that was acceptance. It's not just about being accepted by others, but being able to, you know, think about things and accept what is happening in the moment, being mindful and balancing your thinking, you know, actually processing that and being proactive instead of reactive. And so when we're able to build that resilience and generate those types of behaviors that we can adopt and commit to and almost, you know, become second nature, you know, we'll start changing our attitudes a little bit. And when me and Lisa were looking at this, you know, big fan of Garfield, love it. So we thought this was perfect. So
I will say that this was my least favorite Bill Murray movie. Garfield was not on my top 10 of his movies. I would also say that one of the things that people do a lot is they like ignore it. They ignore the trauma. Oh, that didn't happen to me, or I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. They're the least not fine people on the planet. And how many of us so guilty? Oh, I'm good. No, everything's great. I'm cool. We have to allow ourselves and others to have a safe space that we can be life stinks and we're still grinning, but are we really? We have to be able to create these safe spaces for ourselves and others to encourage them to feel their way through trauma, to think their way through trauma, and to continue to build that resilience so that they can have those skills in place and those tools in their bags that the next event that comes through, or when that one creeps back in, that they can get through it. And again, balancing our thinking. Our mind is an amazing thing. It is an amazing organ. And we can master our thoughts. It just takes a lot of effort. And we can't do it alone. Nobody starts off with, you know, being able to be positive all on their own. It's because someone nurtured us. So we have to be nurturing to others to build resilience, and to build and maintain our own resilience. We need to be nurturing to ourselves. We don't have to be unrealistic. We can definitely identify. We don't have to minimize what's happened or minimize the event. We can recognize it fully for what it is, but we can still balance our thinking with what our options are moving forward from there.
That is pretty much coming to the end of it. Just here are our references, and I want to just go through these slides real quick, and then I'll go back to the original slide, and we can do a Q&A.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
We like questions, by the way. And if this was something that you were all familiar with, let us know. We're always looking to improve. I was talking earlier about something called healing-centered engagement. Trauma-informed care, the perspective has been around for a little while now, and I think for a while it was like a buzzword, and now it's, you know, it's really something that many of us have taken to heart. Our agencies, we're looking at our government, our world through a trauma-informed lens. And now that we're trauma-informed and we recognize trauma and we understand, you know, how people react to trauma in positive and negative ways, and how trauma is pervasive throughout, you know, human history, what comes next? How do we get past trauma? Well, we know we have to build resilience for that, but what comes after that? And one of the things, one of the newer models that I like, and it's very much a political model and not a clinical model. Again, it's a political model and not a clinical model, is something called healing-centered engagement. And it really takes the focus from this happened to you and how can we help, to you made it through this and how did you do it? And let's focus on that and let's self-actualize. Let's look at how we can take this pain that you turned into a strength through resilience, and how can we apply that to everything else in your life? Or how can we apply that to your dreams? How can we apply that to your short and long-term goals? And that's something that's really, you know, at the forefront of my mind, is how do we, especially in today's environment, we look around at the news and we see all of these awful things happening, and we see all of these people who are hurting. And if we look at anger, we know that anger stems from pain. Someone hurt me, someone hurt someone I love, and we know that anger is a result of pain. And so if we can look at, you know, our communities as communities in pain and not angry communities, what can we do then to help them move past that? How can we help them build resilience? How can we help them, once they're building resilience, move past that and to spread that out like a ripple in a pond? It only takes one person, and I've always believed that. You can be that person in your circle, in your community, that can branch that out